For decades, colleges and universities have defined diversity by the number of students of color on their campuses. But while strides have been made for racial inclusion, there are a group of students that have often been left behind, those from low-income families. CBS News contributor Leslie Sanchez explores how America's elite schools are trying to change that.
Harvard. For most Americans, it represents the pinnacle of higher education. It's the school of presidents, of Supreme Court justices, of Nobel Prize laureates, and the elite men and women who run America. In the fall of 1973, Harvard welcomed Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, the pioneers of Microsoft, and John Roberts, who would one day become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The class also included 15 high-performing Mexican-American students. They were the first in their families to go to college and predominantly low income. One of the Harvard 15 was Luis Fraga from Corpus Christi, Texas.
I think it was a decision on the part of the admissions office with the support of the university to admit small numbers of low-income students, first-generation to college students, and to see what that would be like. I think the university saw it as a test of whether we could make it.
Fraga did make it.
He is now a prominent figure in academia at Notre Dame and formerly Stanford University.
We met him in Cambridge, Massachusetts last fall, where he was invited to speak at a panel with Ballmer for their reunion.
We have been given a gift. Some of us, Steve and I, the first in our families to go to college, first-generation students, we may have struggled to figure out our place here at the university. Some of us struggled more than others.
Even though all but 2 of the Harvard 15 graduated, we found him on campus alone.
And coming back, I don't know anybody. I didn't know other groups of students who had similar experiences that I had. I came to learn that over time, but it was hard. There were tears.
The civil rights era fueled recognition of the need to include communities of color on college campuses. The decades since have seen significant advances in racial inclusion in higher education.
Harvard offered admission to a freshman class that was a majority non-white in 2017.
But as elite schools continue to strive for diversity, they're facing the question of what that word really means.
Regardless of race, low-income students have seen a minimal amount of growth since the year 2000.
Diversity hasn't quite expanded yet to encapsulate low-income first-gen students. It's not quite in the modern rhetoric yet.
Brandon Buell is from Madison, a small dairy town in upstate New York.
My father was one of 13, grew up on a dairy farm, and because of that I have about 60 aunts, uncles, and first cousins. And it just so happens that even though I'm one of the youngest out of like all my first cousins, I'm actually going to be the third to even get a bachelor's.
Out of all 60?
Out of like all 60.
He's an applied mathematics major and president of Harvard's relatively new first-generation student union. It's one of the growing number of groups popping up in college campuses for students from low-income families.
You know, we don't have our families who have gone to college. We don't have like parents who've gone through the process. So the whole issue of, you know, how to get financial aid, which tests to take.
FAFSA?
Exactly. Like, what's FAFSA? I have the internet to thank for a lot of the insight I had about applications to the Ivy League.
Groups like Buell seek to create a space for students who have similar struggles adapting to life at an elite school like Harvard, where nearly a third of the students come from legacy families. At the nation's most competitive colleges, students from the richest quarter of the population outnumber the poorest quarter by 25 to 1.
Low-income and working-class students of all races are essentially shut out.
Richard Collenberg is an author and expert in education policy. He's also a Harvard graduate.
So we end up with a phenomenon where places like Harvard are bringing together fairly wealthy kids of all colors.
You just look around campus now, you still see there's a lot of money, there's a lot of like legacy in this institution, but slowly but surely it's like opening up to a new generation of people who weren't born into any sort of, you know, prosperity or weren't born to inherit anything.
For students like Brandon, access to a Harvard education can launch them from one socioeconomic class to another. A poor student has a nearly 60% chance to become a rich adult if they can get into and attend an Ivy League school. Fraga's class of 77 is a prime example. In addition to Gates, Ballmer, and Roberts, Out of the Harvard 15 came lawyers, physicians, academics, and corporate directors. They didn't attend the official class reunion, but they agreed to meet in California to hold their own. They went to the home of classmate Rick Hernandez, now chairman of the board of McDonald's and a director at Wells Fargo.
My father was in the LAPD. My mother was a homemaker.
My parents were both illiterate. They had zero education. So they had no idea what I was doing all my school years. I didn't show them my report cards because they couldn't read.
When I was growing up in San Antonio, my ambition as a kid was to be a garbage man, because every garbage man I saw came by the house was Mexican American.
When I left home, my father told me, don't come back for 4 years. So my hopes were I was going to get through those 4 years, get my degree, and be able to come home.
What a mandate.
Goodness knows what I was going to be doing all by myself in this foreign place.
I will always identify myself as poor because I grew up poor. And I really don't care whether they're Mexican American or black or Chinese or Indian or white. I think a poor person has the same goals, the same aspirations, the same needs, the same desires for their children.
Despite the challenges, they did succeed, and many passed their legacy privilege on to their own children who attended Harvard and other elite colleges.
And the irony is, among the reasons that they're admitting fewer is because more of our children are applying and getting in.
There are studies that find that being a legacy can increase your chances of admission by as much as 45 percentage points. So what that means is if, based on the merits, you had a 20% chance of getting in, now suddenly you have a 65% chance of getting in, just because of who your mommy or daddy was.
So what is the solution? Most of the Ivies have introduced generous financial aid packages in the past 15 years.
At Harvard, any student admitted from a family that makes less than $65,000 essentially doesn't pay tuition or room and board. Princeton has a similar policy, and thanks to new admissions practices focusing on socioeconomic status, 28% of their freshman class was low income or first generation in 2017.
But the question is not about aid, it's about access. Collenberg believes the true answer could lie in a lawsuit filed against Harvard by a group of Asian American applicants who say they were rejected based on their race.
They believe the school favors other minority groups.
If the case makes its way to the Supreme Court, a decision in favor of the applicants could change how colleges approach affirmative action once again, effectively forcing a broader look at the word diversity.
Conservative Supreme Court justices who don't like the use of race in admissions may ultimately usher in what I would argue is a much more liberal policy, one in which institutions like Harvard would end up looking much more closely at class disadvantage, which I think would be a good thing for our society.
We were all given a privilege that brings with it a responsibility. It has to be more important to us to think of what we can do for other people's children.